Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be addressing a topic that is related to a lot of questions that I've been getting recently, which is how to deal with clients who ask for lots of revisions. So this is a topic that is something that I have struggled with myself and can be an extremely frustrating situation when you're stuck in it. So it's something I've thought a lot about and kind of tried to build structures into the way that I work to help deal with that. So this is kind of something that I've touched on previously in a video that I did a little while ago on contracts and invoicing, and I included the basic points that I'm always sure to include in a client agreement, whether it's going to be a contract, a paper contract, or an email agreement. Whatever, I went over all of the bullet points of things that I try to include. So there are 2 of those points. I think there were like 9 or 10 in that original video, which I will link to on the screen. But there are 2 that are specifically related to kind of keeping the revisions in check. And that's what we're going to go over today. So those 2 things are defining the scope of the work and explicitly stating the number of revisions allowed and the process for revisions. So first we're going to get into the scope of the work. But actually, before I get into that, I do want to just say everything I'm going to talk about today kind of hinges on the idea that you would have good, clear communication with your client before starting on a project. So I know some of the time, if a client contacts you and you really want to dive right in and get working, especially if they have a tight deadline, it can be tempting to just respond right away and say, yes, you'll do it, and quote them your price or agree to their budget, whatever. But that is, in my experience, how I've ended up in the worst binds with clients related to the ever-increasing revisions. So yeah, everything I'm going to talk about basically hinges on the idea that you're going to have good communication with your client before you get started. So that being said, the first thing that you want to be sure to cover related to this is the scope of the work. So the scope of the work is the place that you're going to want to detail out exactly what you're making for the client. So some things that you would want to cover here are the number of illustrations, whether you're making 1 illustration or 5 or 20, the size of the illustrations, and that would be true whether somebody is like buying a physical illustration for their home or whether you're doing an illustration for a magazine or a label. The subject of the illustrations, and this is an area where you want to get surprisingly detailed, or at least my personal approach is to get pretty detailed here. And for example, like say if the subject is an apple pie, if you've been asked to illustrate an apple pie, you want to indicate how the pie will be presented. Is it going to be on a plate? Is it going to be in a dish? Is it going to be a slice? Is it going to be a whole pie? Will it have a lattice top? All of those sorts of things, basically like what is the subject in detail. And in order to be able to fill out that section well, you're going to need some information from the client. So a client may come to you and say, oh, I'd love an illustration of an apple pie. And rather than responding right away saying, great, it'll cost this much, ask them questions. Ask them what kind of pie they want, whether it's a slice, whether it's a whole, everything that we just mentioned. Ask the client those questions. And you might even want to include some photo examples. Do you prefer this kind of a pie or that kind of a pie? Just to get really clear before you agree on a price and before you agree to start the project on what exactly it is that they're looking for. And hand in hand with that, as an area that has a lot of detail, is the style of the illustration. So this is where I would typically get really explicit and say something like illustration to be created in my usual style with typical level of detail, and I might include some examples from my existing portfolio. Like if a client has contacted me with an example, which happens a lot, they might say like, oh, I really like this piece. I'd like it to be in this style. So if it's an example that the client has sent me, I'll use that as the example, or if they didn't, I'll run a couple of examples by them. So this is a way that I can concretely say it's going to have this kind of style, this kind of level of detail, and it will be realistic in full color from 3/4 view or from whatever perspective. So pretty detailed there with the combination of like describing what exactly the subject is and how exactly it's going to be rendered. It's important to just get very, very detailed there, because that's number one, that's going to help you understand what exactly the client is wanting. And it's just a way to avoid common miscommunications during the illustration process. So as an illustrator and as a visual person, I find it helpful to constantly remind myself that just because something seems like it's common sense and doesn't need to be explicitly stated to me, doesn't mean that it's going to seem that way to the client. And that's especially true if you're working with maybe smaller companies or individuals who are just buying illustrations for their, or paintings or whatever for their home. Because these people may not have a lot of experience in terms of visual vocabulary. So they may just be saying they want a slice of an apple pie and have something specific in mind, but not really naturally articulate it. And then if you have something in mind of what you think an apple pie is, right there's a huge amount of miscommunication that can happen. And miscommunication equals more revisions. So just being clear to get on the same page from the get-go is so important. So once you've kind of laid down what the scope of the work is and you're really clear on that, another point that you're going to want to include in your agreement is a revision schedule. So a revision schedule is where I would clearly indicate how many revisions are allowed, and a revision is a change that the client makes to an illustration. So I would indicate how many revisions I allow total and where, at what point in the process I allow those revisions, and what kind of revisions I allow at each stage of the process. So this is really tailored to my process and the way that I work and my style, but it would be, it can be adapted or changed depending on what your style is like. So yeah, just keep that in mind as I go over this. But basically, I typically will allow 2 rounds of revision. Sometimes I do allow more if it's for a really complicated piece or a really large piece, in which case that increases the price. But typically I have the 2 rounds of revision, and the first round I'll allow it at the sketch phase. And the sketch phase is when I create anywhere from 1 to 3 different black and white pencil sketches. Sometimes it's a digital sketch, but just a line sketch just to get the idea of the composition of the subject, what's going to be included, the basic shapes, where they are, all of that. There's very little detail, no color. It's just to get clear on what's being presented and where it's being presented. And I'll do only one if it's something really simple, like if it's just a slice of apple pie, I probably will be only doing 1 sketch. But if it's something more complex, like maybe a bunch of pies in a bakery window or something, then I probably would do 3 sketches. And so this is all stuff that I would write down in the client agreement, and I'm going to have that included in the description box. So if I'm going over this too quickly, or if you want to revisit it later, please just take a look at the description box and feel free to lift that language and use it yourself. You'll definitely want to adapt it for your own process, obviously. But yeah, feel free to draw from that. So I'll typically say something like, say it's going to be this, slice of apple pie. I'll say, client will receive 1 initial black and white line sketch as a low-res JPG. They'll have the opportunity to approve the composition, or if it's more than 1 sketch, they'll get to first kind of select their favorite of the 3. So they'll have the opportunity to either approve the composition or request changes. And this is the opportunity to request changes to things like layout, composition, shape and size of the subjects, and their placement, etc. And then once I receive your feedback, I'll incorporate it, etc., etc. So here, what's happening is I'm making it clear to the client that they're going to have an opportunity for revision, and what kind of revisions are acceptable at this phase in the process. So at this point, I would pretty much allow any changes that kind of fell into that scope that I just laid out above. So if it's a compositional change like placement or what's included or not included, I pretty much will allow it. So some examples of that would be, say if a client initially had wanted a lattice top pie and then they changed their mind and they just want it to be a full crust or a crumb topping, I would allow that. Or if a client wanted to add a scoop of ice cream or a sprig of mint on the top, I would do that too. Something that I wouldn't accommodate without increasing the price is if the client wanted to, let's say, change from one slice of pie to 5 pies on a tabletop, or from the one slice of pie to a hand reaching down above with a fork. And the reason I wouldn't accommodate either of those is because they're adding in an entirely new element that wasn't at all included in our original agreement. And I'm going to talk about how I address that, what I do if a client does ask for something that's out of the scope in the next section here. So that's what I would typically include in terms of like the sketch phase revisions. And then I also allow a revision at the final phase of the process. So this would be after the illustration is, in my mind, complete, after it's full color, after it's all done. And at this point, I would write something into the agreement that would read something like this. Low-res JPGs of the final illustrations will be sent to the client for approval. Client will then approve the illustrations or have a final opportunity to request minor edits. This is the time to request changes such as the darkening or lightening of the color, adding more highlights or shadows, etc. Additional revisions after this point or beyond this scope will be billed at blank per hour, and whatever your standard hourly rate is. So I'm doing the same thing here I did in the sketch phase, which is to make it clear to the client that they're going to have an opportunity for revision and what kind of revisions are acceptable at this point. And I'm also telling them what's going to happen if they go beyond that scope, beyond those revisions. So at this point, as I detailed there, I would accept small changes which don't require structural changes, compositional changes, since those are things that should have been dealt with at the initial sketch phase. So if the client wanted me to make the apples in the pie look shinier, I would totally do that. Maybe add some additional highlights. If they wanted the crust to look more textured, I would do that too. Could make it look more flaky by adding some darker areas and increasing the lightness in the light areas, adding more value variation basically. But if at this point the client came and made a request to add a scoop of ice cream, say, I would not do that because it would require me to do some major backtracking and to rework large parts of the illustration. So those are the two kind of sketch phases that I have. And like I said, you might have other ones. You might want to offer an opportunity for revision at an earlier phase when there's sort of like just the start of color. The reason I don't do that is because I find that a lot of the time it just confuses the client, because if they're used to seeing my work, which is relatively detailed, and then they see an earlier phase of it, sometimes, well, almost always when I've done that, the comments I receive are like, oh, please be sure to make this color darker to finish it, basically. So it's all things that I would do anyway. So I found for me the most productive is to allow the major compositional changes when it's just the line drawing, and then to have those kind of like final tweaks at the final phase after the drawing is completed. But it may be different depending on your process. So what happens if and when the client does go ahead and request these changes that are beyond the scope of your initial agreement? So even with the most clear, beautifully written agreement and the dreamiest, nicest client, this is still a situation that you will find yourself in. It's just a part of this kind of work. So the best thing is to be prepared for when it happens. And first step of preparation is what we've already covered, which is having that clear kind of agreement and communication beforehand. And the next step of that is what you do when the client kind of steps outside of that agreement. So, so I already mentioned a couple of examples of ways that could happen. If, for example, at the sketch phase, the client wanted me to include a hand reaching down with a fork. I would respond to that request with something like, of course, I would be happy to include a hand with a fork hovering over the pie. Based on the terms of our agreement, this will cost an additional blank, as it is incorporating an additional subject that wasn't included in our project scope. Please let me know if you'd like to move forward with this. And again, another example I mentioned is if it's at the final stage, if they want to add that scoop of ice cream, I'd say something very similar. Of course, I'd be happy to, based on the terms of our agreement, it will cost this much. as it's a significant compositional change that wasn't covered in the sketch phase of the project. And please let me know if you'd like to move forward, etc. Or another thing that could happen would be if after the final edit had been completed, the client wanted to change one more thing. So if they've been allowed two rounds, they're actually asking for a third round. Say if they wanted an area that they had requested to be darkened to actually be lightened back up if they changed their mind, or if they just wanted one more thing, I would say, of course, I'd be happy to do that. Based on the terms of our agreement, it's going to cost this much, as it is a third round of revisions and our agreement only accommodates 2 rounds. And it's super important with any of these examples that in addition to telling them how much extra it's going to cost, that you let the client know if it's going to impact the timeline. Because for some clients, especially for larger corporate clients, the additional cost may be fine. But if this is going to mean that you have to turn in the project a day late or even a few hours late, that may not be okay. So be really clear in indicating how much extra it will cost, and also in how that additional edit will impact the timeline. So overall, the message is, yes, I'd be happy to do that based on the terms of our agreement. Here's how much it would cost. Here's why it would cost that. And here's how it would impact the timeline. So you can see I am not really saying no. I'm saying, yes, I'd be happy to do that, but here's what it would take. There are the situations when I would just outright say no to a client. They have happened, but they're few and far between. For the most part, I really do try to accommodate the client while also making it work for my own job and my own schedule and all of that other stuff. So that's basically my approach to how I would deal with the subject of revisions with clients. But I do want to touch on really quick what you can do if you are already in a difficult situation. So if you're already working with a client who's been asking for beyond the scope revisions or lots of additional revisions, and you don't have that really solid agreement to refer back to, there are a couple of things you can do, kind of 2 options, 2 paths you can take. The first is to basically just kind of grit your teeth and deal with it. With the knowledge that this is only one client, and the next time I work with anybody or the next time I work with this client again, I will have a good agreement. And the reasons for doing that, in my opinion, would be if it's a client that you really would like to work with again, if they're a good client, if overall they've been okay to work with and they've paid on time and stuff, but they've just been asking for these additional revisions, or whatever you would define as a good client. If it's somebody you want to work with again, it will be worth considering just kind of gritting your teeth and dealing with it. And the alternative is to try to set a boundary. So say if the client has come to you with the 4th additional revision, one thing you could say would be, I'd be happy to accommodate this final revision. After this, any additional changes will be billed at blank amount per hour. And that can work. It's something I've done before, but it also, it's possible that the client will be upset by that. And the reason it can be upsetting to them is because for them, it feels like you're changing the terms of the deal, because you've just been happily doing, well, from their view, happily doing all these additional revisions. And now suddenly you're saying, oh, it's going to cost more. So you just kind of have to weigh that and say, is this worth it to me to basically turn off this client and have it so they may not want to work with me again? And there are some situations where absolutely that's true. You know, if this has just been taking over your life and making you so stressed and impacting your other clients and the rest of your work, then yes, it would be worth it essentially to just draw that boundary and say, this is what needs to happen. But if they're a client that you want to work with again, you may want to kind of weigh your options and decide. And in either scenario, if and as the next time you work with this client or other clients, you start implementing these ideas and having a more explicit agreement, you want to be sure to draw the client's attention. Cat's coming with her jingle bell. You want to be sure to draw the client's attention to those parts of the agreement. So if this is someone who's worked with you before and you have never really had explicit formal agreements, they may just kind of skim over that stuff, assuming, oh, I know how this person works. I know what their process is like. So if you've made changes to that, you need to be sure to draw the client's attention to it, again, just as a part of that kind of good communication. So I think that is about all I have to say on this topic. I really hope it was helpful. And again, I think I mentioned all of this stuff is going to be in the description box. So please take a look there and feel free to use what you like, not use what doesn't work for you. So if you like this video, if you found it helpful, please leave a comment and give it a thumbs up. And be sure to subscribe as I post new videos every week on Friday. Hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.